Hi, today I'm going to teach you about this little simple sewing tool called a seam gauge. So seam gauge is used quite a lot in sewing, especially when you're looking for precision. Also when you're learning to differentiate small sizes, such as what is the difference between 5/8 and 1/4 of an inch. So on your seam gauge, you're going to notice that there are units. So here I have a 2 and a 3, and that composes one whole unit. Now you'll notice in between the beginning and the end of the unit there are lots of little marks around here. So you'll notice that this one only says 2.5, 1.5, so on and so forth. So how do you know if your teacher tells you, hey, go measure 1/4 of an inch, or hey, go measure 5/8 of an inch? Which one are you going to do? Well, this may be helpful for you. So first of all, you have to realize that when you're using technical tools such as a wrench, if someone says, get me a 5/8 inch wrench, or 2/16 or something like that, they're speaking of one unit that has been broken into smaller pieces. With the seam gauge, we break it into 8 parts, okay? Whereas typical let's say a foot is broken into one unit. One foot is broken into 12 inches, okay? So we have a whole unit, okay? Now, for the seam gauge, it is broken into 8 separate pieces. So you will notice 8 marks. Now, if I pick back up my seam gauge, see along here on the top, we're paying attention to this. We're not worrying about this on the bottom here, okay? Just act like that's not there, because we're not going to use it right now. But up here on the top, between here and here, there are those 8 marks that break it into a unit, okay? Now, those 8 marks look something like this. Sometimes you'll look at a seam gauge and they're marked independently, other times not, but in general they all have this. Now this is actually a message. It's kind of like a secret code that you'll learn to use very proficiently in this class. And here it is. So if I have a half of a unit and I've broken it down into 1/2 and it's in 8s, and I have 4/8, but we don't need to call it 4/8 because if we reduce it, then we end up with 1/2 an inch, okay? And then just like with money, if we have half of a dollar unit, we end up having a half a dollar, okay? So we end up with quarters, so you might have 75 cents if we're talking about dollars, or 3/4 of a dollar, or you might have 1/4, okay? 25 cents, okay? So this is what the marks go. From 1/2 an inch over, we have 3/4 or 1/4. And you'll notice on the bottom that these are simplified versions of these numbers. So here you have like 2/8 and 1/8. I can't read that. Sorry, 6/8, okay? And then from there, we run into the last part, which is super important for you to know for this class. So we have our 1/2, which is 4/8, and on each side there again we've broken them down, so we have 1/4 and 3/4, and then in between each of those we just start ticking off the 8s. So 1/8 would really be 1/8. Can't break that down any further, okay? 1/4 was originally, you guessed it, 2/8, and so on and so forth as we move over. So we're just counting off how many marks over in the unit. 1, 2, 3, 4/8 would be 1/2, and so on and so forth. And that's how you use a seam gauge. You'll notice on the seam gauges there are indentations, for example on the top, that shows where a whole unit ends, and then there's a slider, and the slider will permit you to measure it up against something so you don't have to constantly look at the measurement, okay? So if I'm measuring this and I'm looking for that particular, let's say 1/2 an inch, then I can just lay it down against it, okay? So very helpful tool. And just remember, you just have to count over the marks to see where you're at with the eighth, and then you can always simplify it. Instead of saying something like, well, that's 6/8, you can say that's 3/4. Okay? All right, have fun using your seam gauge. Get it.